Have you ever felt guilty about praying silently, as if God only heard spoken words? Have you ever been afraid that He wasn't listening because your lips weren't moving? Many people believe that if prayer is not audible, it has no value. But what if this idea is taking you away from intimacy with God instead of bringing you closer? Today, you'll discover something you may never have heard before. A biblical truth that can set your heart free and completely transform the way you communicate with God. In this video, I will show you, based on Scripture, that praying silently is not only possible, but it is powerful. You will understand that God doesn't need to hear your voice, He needs to hear your heart. And in the end, you will pray with a freedom you may never have experienced before. So stay with me until the end, because this revelation can change your devotional life forever. And if you've ever been through this, if you've ever felt stuck when praying because the silence seemed empty, comment now, "God hears me in silence." Yes, write this here in the comments as an act of faith and liberation. And more, tell me where you're watching from, because I want to know how far this message is reaching. Take advantage and subscribe to the channel, because the next videos will deepen your walk with God even further. If you believe that true prayer doesn't need noise, just sincerity, then this video is for you. Some people feel disconnected from God because when they close their eyes to pray, they can't say anything. Their hearts overflow, but their mouths remain silent. And then the question arises, is God listening even so? We grew up in religious environments that often considered the volume of prayer as synonymous with faith. The most fervent were those who cried out the loudest, who spoke in a powerful voice, who filled the room with eloquent and expressive words. And there is nothing wrong with praying intensely, but what about those who can only pray in the silence of their soul, and those who, in the moment of greatest pain, can only feel, but cannot speak? Does the silence of a prayer also reach heaven? This is a hidden wound in many Christian hearts. The idea that God only hears what is audible creates an invisible prison. The person feels spiritually invalid. They believe they are failing because they do not pray like others. And little by little, they stop praying altogether because they think their way is not good enough. This has made many sincere sons and daughters spiritually ill, who, instead of feeling relief and connection, feel guilt and inadequacy whenever they come before God. But what if I told you that silence in prayer is not an absence of faith, but one of the purest ways of relating to God? That, in fact, in many passages of the Bible, heaven answered precisely silent prayers. Yes, God hears hearts, not just voices. He discerns the innermost being, even before a word is formed in the mouth. One of the most powerful accounts of this is that of Hannah, the mother of the prophet Samuel. For years, Hannah carried the pain of not being able to bear children. She was teased by Peninnah, humiliated and ashamed. One day, she entered the temple and began to pray, but she could not utter any words. Her lips moved, but there was no sound. The priest Eli thought she was drunk because he could not understand that kind of silent prayer. However, God understood, and He answered. That silent prayer generated a promise, and from that promise was born Samuel, one of the greatest prophets in the history of Israel. What does this show us? That men may not understand a silent prayer, but God does. That we don't need to shout to be heard or use flowery words to be accepted. What we need is sincerity, real presence, a broken heart. Hannah's prayer wasn't powerful because it was silent. It was powerful because it was sincere. And that's the key. The power of prayer is not in the volume, but in the truth it carries. How many times have you felt like Hannah? Surrounded by pressures, misunderstood by the people around you, and when you tried to pray, all you could do was move your lips in silence. Maybe not even that. Maybe not even your lips moved. Maybe it was just a thought, a deep sigh, a tear rolling down your face. And yet God was listening, because God hears the spirit before He hears the voice. He sees the heart before the sound even rises to heaven. This is a liberation that many people need to experience. It's not about teaching a new method of prayer, but about undoing the weight of rules that God never imposed. Because prayer is not a performance. It's an encounter, and true encounters don't always need words. Sometimes, just being with someone in silence can create a deep connection. And with God, it's even more intimate. He's not just by our side, He lives inside us. He knows every pain, every fear, every hidden desire, and He knows exactly what we want to say, even when we can't say anything. The absence of words is not the absence of faith. Sometimes it is precisely the greatest proof of it. When everything falls apart inside, and even without words, a person still stands before God. That is faith, raw faith, faith in the flesh, faith without adornments. And it is this faith that moves the heart of God. So, if you have ever felt frustrated because you cannot pray like others, know that God has never compared you to anyone. He is not looking for pretty voices, well-formulated prayers or theological phrases. He is looking for truth, hearts that are willing to present themselves as they are, even if it is in silence. This is the beginning of a change of mindset, a renewal of understanding. What follows will help you realize that there are times when the voice fails, but the Spirit speaks, and that in this invisible dialogue, there is a force that the natural world does not understand, but heaven immediately recognizes. There are times when the soul is so tired that even trying to form a sentence seems like an impossible effort. The body is present, but the mind is distant. The heart wants to pray, but the words won't come out. And in this void of sound, many think they have failed spiritually, that praying is necessarily speaking, articulating, expressing clearly. And if this doesn't happen, then God doesn't listen, God doesn't act, God moves away. But what if the most honest prayer you can make on certain days is just a sigh? What if heaven is attentive just when your voice fails and all that's left is your spirit in silence? Emotional pain, trauma, loss, anxiety, and even shame can silence us. Silence our mouths, silence our bodies, silence our wills. When this happens, silence can feel like an abyss, but to God, silence is not absence. It is a fertile field where the Holy Spirit begins to work. It is in this silence filled with unspoken feelings that He comes into play in a more intimate way. Because God is not limited to what is said, He responds to what is felt. The Apostle Paul, in his letter to the Romans, wrote something profoundly liberating. He said that the Spirit helps us in our weakness, because many times we do not know how to pray as we should. But the Spirit Himself intercedes for us with groanings that cannot be expressed. In other words, there are prayers that do not pass through our mouths, but come straight from our spirit. And these groans, which not even we can translate, are perfectly understood by God. This verse is a relief to anyone who has tried to pray and failed in the middle of a sentence. To anyone who has cried before God without being able to explain why. To anyone who did not have the strength to bend their knees but still wanted to be in His presence. The Spirit intercedes. He understands things about yourself that you do not understand, and He takes all of this to the Father in a perfect way. Now think about how many times you thought you were far from God, when in fact your spirit was silently crying out. You weren't far away, you were just speechless, and yet God was near. Because His presence doesn't depend on our performance, but on His grace. He draws near to the broken, He stoops to the weak. He doesn't require introductions, He just wants the truth. How many times does a child run into his father's arms without saying anything? He just cries, he just throws himself in, and the father understands. There is no need for formal explanations when the bond is deep. It is like that with God. He is our Father, and He understands our silences more than we understand our words. Sometimes the deepest cries of the soul do not come out of the mouth, but escape through the eyes in the form of tears. And each tear is a word before God, each sigh, a paragraph, each silence, a cry. And here's something we need to maturely accept. Prayer is not about mastering the right words. It's about standing before a God who already knows everything. The goal is not to impress, it's to deliver. The goal is not to appear strong, it's to be sincere. And sometimes the greatest sincerity is to say, "Lord, I don't even know what to say." That in itself is prayer. And the Holy Spirit takes that confession and turns it into intercession. He completes it where you can't continue. Maybe you grew up thinking that God only answers well-made prayers. But today, you need to learn that He answers honest prayers, even when they have no form, even when they have no sound. Faith is not in words, it is in surrender. And if you are willing to surrender, even without knowing what to say, God has already begun to answer. This awareness changes everything, because you no longer need to run away from prayer when you are without strength. On the contrary, it is precisely in these moments that prayer becomes deeper, not because of what you say, but because of what you feel. And God knows your feelings better than you do. He reads between the lines of your silence. He deciphers the codes of your weariness. He understands the language of the soul. This should bring rest, relief, peace. To know that you can simply be silent before God and yet be completely understood by Him. This is what makes a relationship with God so different from any other. He doesn't demand explanations. He doesn't demand formalities. He just asks that you be there. Body, soul, and spirit. And when you are there, even in silence, something happens. Even if you don't realize it, heaven is moving. The Spirit is moving. God is listening. There is a depth in silence that no words can reach, and that depth is where miracles happen. It is where healing begins, where faith grows, where the soul rests. So the next time you don't know what to pray, don't beat yourself up. Just surrender. Just be. Because God's presence doesn't require sound, only truth. And it's in that space of sincere silence that the greatest spiritual connection can happen. A connection that doesn't depend on noise, but on surrender. And when that surrender happens, even the prayer that no one hears becomes the most powerful. There is a place where faith flourishes in a more intimate way. A place where there is no audience, no applause, no records. A space where only you and God exist. No human eye sees, no ear hears, but all of heaven bends down to hear what is said there. This place is the secret, and it is there that prayer finds its purest form. Because when no one is watching, the heart reveals who we really are. Jesus taught this very clearly. He not only taught us what pray, but also as pray, and more, where pray. He said, when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen, and your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. This teaching from Jesus, recorded in Matthew chapter 6, was not just practical instruction. It was a course correction. It was a call to get back to the essence of prayer, away from the surface and back to the truth. In Jesus' time, many religious people prayed in public squares, temples, and synagogues, loudly and with pompous speeches. But they were not interested in speaking to God. They just wanted to be seen by people. And Jesus got straight to the point. These people had already received their reward, the attention of others, but those who want to touch God's heart need to go beyond appearances. They need to seek the invisible. They need to pray where no one sees. It is in this type of prayer that there is no character, no performance. There is only truth. Because when you are alone with God, there is no one to pretend to. And it is exactly in this place that the Spirit works most deeply. There are no distractions. There is no competition. There are no masks. Only what is real remains, and what is real God transforms. There is a hidden beauty in silent prayer done in secret. It needs no stage. It does not depend on emotion. It does not require structure. It is raw, sincere, transparent, and therefore powerful. Many of the greatest spiritual changes a person can experience happen in this intimate space with God. The liberation that no one saw, the healing that no one announced, the transformation that no one applauded. But God saw, God heard, and God rewarded. The logic of the kingdom of God is contrary to human logic. What is hidden from men is precious to the Father. The prayer that no one hears is precisely the one that moves his heart the most. And this completely changes our motivation. Because suddenly, prayer stops being a habit to keep up appearances and becomes a refuge for true encounter. And when this happens, prayer stops being a duty and becomes a pleasure. Jesus also practiced this prayer. He would retreat to deserted places, mountains, and gardens. Even though he was the Son of God, he knew the importance of being alone with the Father. He did not need an audience. He sought depth. This shows that even with all the demands and crowds around, Jesus prioritized the secret, the silence, the intimate. This teaches us that there are no valid excuses. There will always be room to find God, even in the midst of the rush. Because the real altar is not in the temple, it is within. And when we access that secret place within ourselves, even for a few minutes, it has an eternal impact. A simple whisper spoken in faith can reach the throne of God. A thought delivered in reverence can provoke a divine response. And maybe you've never been taught this. Maybe you believe that in order to pray, you have to be in a certain position in a sacred place with certain words. But God is not bound by rituals. He is a father, and parents listen to their children anywhere, at any time. Even when they can't speak, they can only think. Even when they just close their eyes and say, "Lord, I am here." That is enough. This freedom changes a person's spiritual life because it eliminates the burden, it eliminates the obligation, it transforms what was an effort into pleasure. And then, what once seemed difficult becomes natural. You begin to realize that God is present on the way home, in the silence of the shower, in the tears at night, in the pause between one task and another. You don't have to wait for an ideal environment. The ideal environment is your surrender. Prayer is not about form. It is about essence. It is not about what others think you are doing. It's about what God sees when no one else is looking. And it is in this invisible space that the greatest miracles are born. Because where there is truth, God acts. Where there is sincerity, He responds. And where there is silence with faith, He manifests Himself. And that's why, even if no one has ever seen your prayer struggle, even if you've never prayed out loud or led a faith meeting, your prayer still has power. Because God doesn't measure the impact of a prayer by its sound. He measures it by its delivery. And maybe, up until now, you've felt like your prayers have been too small, too simple, too quiet. But the truth is, with God, there is no such thing as too much or too little when the heart is present. There is only one thing He seeks: worship in spirit and in truth. And if this truth is within you, then the prayer that no one sees is actually the prayer that God values most. And that is what we will continue to talk about. Even though we know that God hears our silence, there are still times when this silence seems too heavy, not because of a lack of faith, but because of the waiting. You pray, trust, and remain silent before God, and yet it seems like there is no answer. God's silence begins to feel like absence. And our minds begin to ask questions that our hearts don't have the courage to answer. Is He really here? Has He abandoned me? Is my prayer getting stuck on the ceiling? And in this dark and silent place, many give up, not out of malice, but out of exhaustion. This kind of silence hurts. It hurts because we don't know if it's a test or a punishment. It hurts because we feel invisible, even before the God who claims to see everything. It's as if we're talking to a closed sky, but that's exactly where one of the most human and at the same time most profound stories in the Bible comes in. Elijah on Mount Horeb. Elijah was a man of God, a prophet known for his courage. He was the one who confronted King Ahab. He was the one who prayed, and the fire from heaven came down. He defied the prophets of Baal and saw the power of God manifest before the entire nation. But even with all this, he fell apart. After a threat from Queen Jezebel, Elijah fled. And in the desert, he wished for death. He felt alone, weak, abandoned, exhausted. And then God leads him to Mount Horeb. There, Elijah enters a cave. And it is in this environment of darkness and isolation that heaven decides to speak to him, but in a completely different way than Elijah expected. First came a mighty wind, but God was not in the wind. Then came an earthquake, but God was not in the earthquake either. Then came a fire, and still God was not in the fire. Elijah knew God in powerful manifestations. He had seen fire descend on Mount Carmel. He had experienced the supernatural, but this time God did not come in a roar. He came in silence. The biblical text says that after the fire came a soft whisper, and it was in that almost imperceptible sound that God was present. It was in that stillness that Elijah heard the divine voice. Not a thunderclap, but a whisper. Not a show, but a touch. Not an explosion, but a calm presence. This experience changes our perspective because it shows that God does not always manifest himself in the way we expect. Sometimes we expect quick answers, clear signs, intense emotions, but he chooses to come in silence, in the innermost, in the place where only those who are silent can hear. God's whisper does not compete with the noise of the world. He reveals himself to those who are willing to slow down, to stop, to listen. Elijah, previously accustomed to a God who acted with power, needed to learn to recognize the God who manifests himself with gentleness. And so do we, because there are days when we look for God in the noise and he is waiting for us in the stillness. How many times have you been disappointed by thinking that God was distant, when in reality he was just speaking softly to draw you closer? A whisper demands attention, it demands presence, and it demands trust, because it's not about the impact it makes, it's about the relationship it builds. Elijah came out of that cave restored. Not because he had a great vision, but because he had a personal encounter. God spoke to him in simple yet profound ways, and that was enough. He didn't need miracles at that moment. He just needed to be reminded that God was still with him. And maybe today, you are in that same cave, hiding, hurting, thinking that your spiritual life is in ruins because you no longer feel the same fervor, the same fire, the same passion. But maybe you are simply being led into a new kind of relationship with God. A deeper relationship, a quieter one, a more stable one, less noisy but more real. God's silence is not an absence, it is an invitation, a call to listen with your spirit, not with your ears, to realize that his presence does not depend on sensations, but on faith, to understand that even when nothing seems to be happening, he continues to work. Even if you don't see it, even if you don't hear it, even if you don't feel it. And this silent faith is one of the most mature ways to walk with God, because it doesn't depend on constant tests. It rests in the character of who God is. It says, even in silence I trust, even without an answer I follow. And it is in this kind of faith that God finds room to act in a deeper way. Maybe God isn't speaking loudly now, not because he has abandoned you, but because he wants to teach you to listen in a different way. And when we learn to listen to the whisper, we begin to perceive his presence in unexpected places. In the midst of pain, in the midst of doubt, in the midst of silence. What Elijah experienced on the mountain was not just a reunion with God, it was a spiritual reconfiguration. He left there not just with instructions, he left with a new perception. He understood that God is not restricted to spectacular manifestations. He is within, and that is what changes everything. And when this truth settles within us, we begin to realize that many of the battles we face in our soul can only be resolved in this place where God whispers, and where only silence reveals what noise could never heal. If you believe that God hears even the deepest silence of your heart, write now in the comments, "God hears my silence." This is your declaration of faith, and as a form of recognition, we on the channel will leave a like on your comment and closely monitor your journey of surrender and trust. Do not underestimate the strength of what you carry inside. This simple phrase can be the beginning of a new spiritual freedom. And stay with me, because what comes next may be just the step you needed to pray with more peace, more intimacy, and less guilt. Don't miss this opportunity. The next minute could change everything. There is a depth to the spiritual life that can only be accessed when we learn to be with God without having to say anything. It is a more mature level of faith, where the relationship with the Father no longer depends on the quantity of words, but on the quality of presence. When we understand this, something changes within us. The anxiety of praying correctly gives way to the peace of simply being before Him. And in this peace, we find a new form of communion: silent, contemplative prayer. Many Christians have not yet been taught about this type of prayer. They think that if they are not speaking, they are not praying, that if they are not crying out, they are not seeking. But the Bible shows another reality. In several passages, God invites us to quiet our souls, to stop our inner rush, and to find rest in Him. And in this reverent silence, a more solid, more stable and deeper faith is born. Be still and know that I am God. These words, recorded in Psalm 46:10, are not just advice, they are a call, an invitation to the kind of intimacy that can only be experienced in silence. Because it is when we are silent that we can hear what truly matters. When the voices outside stop, we begin to hear the whisper of heaven within us. Contemplative prayer is not passivity. It is not a spiritual emptiness. On the contrary, it is a state of mindfulness before God. It is when the heart opens, not to speak, but to listen. It is when we place ourselves in His presence without demands, without lists, without expectations, only with surrender. This posture, more than any other, reveals a mature love, a love that does not seek only to receive, but that simply desires to be. Think of a true friendship, a deep relationship between two people who truly love each other. Over time, they no longer need to fill every space with words. Silence becomes comfortable. Presence is enough. It is the same with God. When we learn to rest in Him, without the anxiety of saying or doing, our spirit finds rest. And this rest is also prayer. There is a biblical scene that expresses this well. When Moses is before the Red Sea with the people in despair, God says something curious. "The Lord will fight for you and you shall keep silent." In other words, God was saying, "Be still. I will act." There are times when our part is not to speak, nor run, nor fight. It is simply to be silent and trust. Silence then becomes a declaration of faith, an act of surrender. And perhaps for many who are watching now, this is the greatest lesson: to trust even without speaking, to believe even without seeing, to remain even without feeling. Prayer is not only what we say, it is also the way we place ourselves before God. Sometimes the soul is so burdened that there is no strength to say anything, and yet the simple fact of being there, in silence, is already a powerful expression of faith. It is in this state of silent surrender that great transformations occur. Because when the noise of the mind ceases, we make room for the Spirit to show us what was muffled by distractions. He reveals intentions, heals wounds, brings to light truths that we did not want to face. And the most beautiful thing, He does this with love, with patience, with tenderness. Jesus Himself sought this place. Luke 5:16 says, "But Jesus often withdrew to solitary places and prayed." He withdrew from the hustle and bustle, from the crowds, from His commitments. And why? Because He knew that it was in silence, in solitude, that the Father spoke most clearly. If even Jesus needed these moments, what makes us think that we can live a healthy spiritual life only in the noise of routine? You can cultivate this space too. You can create this habit. It doesn't take a lot of time. It doesn't take rituals. It just takes intention. Close your eyes. Take a deep breath. Imagine yourself in the presence of God. Don't say anything. Just be there. Just listen. Just surrender. That's prayer. That's communion. Over time, you will realize something wonderful. These silent moments are not empty. They are full of presence, full of peace, full of purpose, because God speaks in the silence. He ministers in the silence. He transforms in the silence. And this can be liberating for those who always thought they were praying too little, because now they understand that being with God, even in silence, is more valuable than 1,000 words spoken without giving. The focus is not on quantity, it is on depth. It is not how long you speak, it is how much you give. So, allow yourself to cultivate this wordless spirituality. Rediscover the beauty of contemplation, of stillness, of pause. There is something powerful waiting for you in this silent place. A connection that does not depend on what you say, but on what you feel. And that transforms, heals, restores, without needing a single word. Even after understanding that silence can be a sacred space for prayer, many people still struggle with guilt. They carry within themselves a feeling that they are failing spiritually, that they are not doing enough, that God is disappointed that they are not following all the rituals, schedules, or formats taught. This guilt, however silent it may be, is heavy, and it gradually undermines faith, eroding intimacy with God from within. It's a cruel cycle. A person tries to get closer to God, but can't pray as they've learned they should, so they feel guilty. And because they feel guilty, they avoid prayer, and by avoiding prayer, they feel even more guilty. And so, day after day, their relationship with God becomes a constant attempt to earn something rather than an experience of grace. But that was never God's plan. Never. It was for freedom that Christ set us free. Freedom to approach Him boldly, truthfully, simply, without fear, without masks, without formulas. Prayer was never designed as a test to be passed. It was always an encounter. And encounters don't have fixed rules. They have presence. Unfortunately, religious environments often create patterns that imprison. With the intention of teaching, they end up imposing. With the intention of guiding, they end up limiting. And what should be a place of life becomes a place of fear. How many people were taught to repeat phrases without even understanding what they were saying? How many prayers were said more out of obligation than out of love? And worse still, how many stopped praying altogether because they believed they were not praying right? But God is not bound by our models. He is not impressed by beautiful words, nor does He turn away when we do not have them. He is a father, and a father does not reject a child because he does not know how to speak perfectly. On the contrary, He welcomes him. He listens to the heart before the mouth. He responds to sincerity before eloquence. Jesus told a parable that challenges this religious thinking, that of the Pharisee and the tax collector. The two went up to the temple to pray. The Pharisee used strong words, making a point of saying that he fasted, that he was right, that he was not like the others. The tax collector, on the other hand, with his head bowed, could barely look up to the sky. He beat his chest and said only, "God, have mercy on me, a sinner." Jesus concludes by saying that it was the tax collector, not the Pharisee, who returned home justified. Why? Because God does not seek to show off. He seeks truth. This changes everything. Because it shows us that a simple, short, even silent prayer, but made with repentance and humility, is worth more than empty speeches about connection. And this must set you free. You don't have to fit a mold to be accepted. You don't have to repeat what others say to be heard. You don't have to perform to be loved. God already knows your heart. He knows your struggles. He sees the struggles that no one else sees. And He doesn't have a clipboard in His hand, evaluating how well you pray. He has his arms open, waiting for you to just come closer, as you are, in your own time, in any way you can, even if it's in silence. The cycle of spiritual guilt needs to be broken because it does not come from God. It comes from religiosity. It comes from comparison. It comes from the human demand that only those who pray loudly, who cry a lot, who speak beautifully, are spiritual. But God says, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God." Purity of heart is worth more than any outward form. When this truth enters your soul, prayer ceases to be a burden. It becomes a relief. You begin to approach God without fear of doing wrong. You begin to trust that He knows your intention before you act. And finally, you begin to pray freely, lightly, truthfully. Maybe today, all you need to do is forgive yourself. Let go of the pattern that was set for you. Let go of the idea that spirituality can be proven with words, because it is lived with surrender, and true surrender sometimes has no sound. It only has presence. If you have come this far, it is because there is within you a sincere desire to draw closer to God, to experience something true, without masks, without ready-made formulas. And this, in itself, is already a prayer, a silent cry, and you can be sure heaven is listening. You don't have to pray like anyone else. You don't have to follow a script. You don't have to imitate. You just have to allow yourself to be before God in your own way. And little by little, you will see that your relationship with Him flourishes best when it is planted in freedom, not in guilt. Even after understanding that silence can be a sacred space for prayer, many people still struggle with guilt. They carry within themselves a feeling that they are failing spiritually, that they are not doing enough, that God is disappointed that they are not following all the rituals, schedules, or formats taught. This guilt, however silent it may be, is heavy, and it gradually undermines faith, eroding intimacy with God from within. It's a cruel cycle. A person tries to get closer to God, but can't pray as they've learned they should. So they feel guilty, and because they feel guilty, they avoid prayer. And by avoiding prayer, they feel even more guilty. And so day after day, their relationship with God becomes a constant attempt to earn something, rather than an experience of grace. But that was never God's plan. Never. It was for freedom that Christ set us free. Freedom to approach Him boldly, truthfully, simply, without fear, without masks, without formulas. Prayer was never designed as a test to be passed. It was always an encounter. And encounters don't have fixed rules. They have presence. Unfortunately, religious environments often create patterns that imprison. With the intention of teaching, they end up imposing. With the intention of guiding, they end up limiting. And what should be a place of life becomes a place of fear. How many people were taught to repeat phrases without even understanding what they were saying? How many prayers were said more out of obligation than out of love? And worse still, how many stopped praying altogether because they believed they were not praying right? But God is not bound by our models. He is not impressed by beautiful words, nor does He turn away when we do not have them. He is a father, and a father does not reject a child because he does not know how to speak perfectly. On the contrary, He welcomes him. He listens to the heart before the mouth. He responds to sincerity before eloquence. Jesus told a parable that challenges this religious thinking, that of the Pharisee and the tax collector. The two went up to the temple to pray. The Pharisee used strong words, making a point of saying that he fasted, that he was right, that he was not like the others. The tax collector, on the other hand, with his head bowed, could barely look up to the sky. He beat his chest and said only, "God, have mercy on me, a sinner." Jesus concludes by saying that it was the tax collector, not the Pharisee, who returned home justified. Why? Because God does not seek to show off. He seeks truth. This changes everything. Because it shows us that a simple, short, even silent prayer, but made with repentance and humility, is worth more than empty speeches about connection. And this must set you free. You don't have to fit a mold to be accepted. You don't have to repeat what others say to be heard. You don't have to perform to be loved. God already knows your heart. He knows your struggles. He sees the struggles that no one else sees. And he doesn't have a clipboard in his hand, evaluating how well you pray. He has his arms open, waiting for you to just come closer, as you are, in your own time, in any way you can, even if it's in silence. The cycle of spiritual guilt needs to be broken because it does not come from God. It comes from religiosity. It comes from comparison. It comes from the human demand that only those who pray loudly, who cry a lot, who speak beautifully, are spiritual. But God says, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God." Purity of heart is worth more than any outward form. When this truth enters your soul, prayer ceases to be a burden. It becomes a relief. You begin to approach God without fear of doing wrong. You begin to trust that He knows your intention before you act. And finally, you begin to pray freely, lightly, truthfully. Maybe today, all you need to do is forgive yourself. Let go of the pattern that was set for you. Let go of the idea that spirituality can be proven with words, because it is lived with surrender, and true surrender sometimes has no sound. It only has presence. If today you understood that your way of connecting with God is unique and valid, then prove it right now. Comment below, "God hears me my way." This is more than a phrase. It is a commitment to your spiritual freedom. And as a form of recognition, we at the channel will leave a like on your comment and follow your journey with affection. Take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel and continue receiving content that will strengthen your faith, break chains, and bring you even closer to God. Let's go. Sign up now and become part of a group of people who live a real faith without burden and with truth. What was the code that turned the key inside you? Comment below. We want to know which part spoke to your heart the most. And if this video reached you, share it with as many people as possible. Be generous. Just as you were blessed with this content, bless other lives. Now stay with me because the 2 videos suggested on the screen are a fundamental part of the transformation that began today. Each of them will deepen your walk with God even further. Don't put it off. The next step could change everything.